So throughout this video lecture series, we actually talked about several ideas, including the idea that mutations lead to genetic variation. And then when you have this genetic variation, you're going to have different versions of genes. So we talked about that when we talked about Thomas Hunt Morgan coining the idea of a wild type or the original type, and then the mutant types, which are variations of that. And nobody ever said you only can have 2 copies of each type of gene. In genetics, we mentioned the idea of traits which have multiple types of the same gene. Because remember, the same gene can be mutated many times. And so that comes the idea of multiple alleles. So you see that, yes, we are diploid. And yes, we only have 2 alleles of each type. One that we see from mom and then one that we see from dad. And those genes are going to be paired up homolog chromosomes. But it is possible that out there in the population, there might be several different versions of those alleles. And that is what we call a multiple allele trait. And an example of that, there's an allele that has multiple traits for that genetic locus, even though we only carry 2 at a time. Human blood type is a perfect example, and when we have 3 different variations of the alleles. We have the A, the B, and the O. And then we have the AB, which is a combination of A and O. We're going to talk about that. So the blood shows complete dominance and codominance. And I'll explain what that means in a second. So that means A blood types and B blood types always dominate over O blood types. Okay, so the A allele and the B allele dominate over the O. But if you have the A and the O at the same time, they co-dominate and show up at the same time. You know, remember that we talked about that when we did Mendelian genetics. Alright, so A and B are co-dominant and the O is recessive to both. Okay, so let's talk about the alleles of the blood. There are different alleles in the blood system, and basically we're going to have the A type, the B type, the AB type, and the O type. Now remember, the AB type is not a mutation, it is a combination of 2 types of mutations. But what are we talking about here when we talk about blood types? Okay, there are 4 different phenotypes for blood types. You have the type A, type B, type AB, or type O. And that is going to be your phenotypes for the blood type. Okay, and what is this phenotype exactly? The phenotype is basically the presence of certain proteins in the surface of red blood cells. So these red blood cells will have proteins, or glycoproteins. We talked about that when we talked about the cell membrane. Remember, they just basically look like these proteins attached to the cell membrane, and they have these glycolic tails. And these are basically recognition markers which tell the body that those red blood cells belong to the body. Now, there are originally the markers are of A type. So it does seem to be, by studying different kinds of hominids and monkey genetics, that it does seem like the original hominid blood type, at least the blood type which we came from, is the A type. Now, some actual primates evolved the B type, or something that looks like the human B type, separate from the human B type. We came from a primate that had the A blood type. But you also see the B blood type, or something similar to it, in primate groups that are not the same primate group that we came from. And so that means that, kind of what I'm trying to say here is that we and other primates split a long time ago, and there used to be an A type. Now on our tree, it actually have A and B types split. But on the other primate tree that split from this way, A and B also evolved separately there. So it's an example of convergent evolution, and when we do evolution, I'll explain this in more detail. But the point is, we have 3 different kinds of alleles for blood type. Now, that means that you can have a surface protein of type A, a surface protein of type B, and the lack of surface proteins, or a mutation that makes you not have surface proteins at all. So the idea is that the original type was being like this, being the A surface protein. But then a mutation happened, and then that got changed into a variant that's called the B blood type protein. And then another one, so this is probably an example of a missense mutation, which changed the A to B. A nonsense mutation probably changed B to O. And so now you don't have a blood type at all. And then when both of those mutations happen at the same time, or they're gathered together genetically by inheritance patterns, we get the A and B blood type. Okay, that's not a separate mutation; it's just a combination, genetic combination of that blood type. Now, if you have surface proteins of the A type, you think that A is what belongs in your body. So that means that any member that has the blood type, if a cell like that were to enter your body, they'll be considered a foreign cell. That means you're going to have antibodies or defense mechanisms from your immune system against the B type. Now what that means is that basically these are kind of like, I think of them as paint gun machines, and there's these white blood cells which shoot them up and secrete all these antibodies, and then every time something like that, an enemy, comes into the cell, these antibodies kind of attach themselves to the bad cell and say, hello, someone come here and kill this thing because it's an enemy. So the antibodies are markers to attack the enemies. So the A blood type has antibodies against the B type because that's the foreign, that's the one that doesn't belong. The B blood type has antibodies against the A type because that's the one that doesn't belong. The AB blood type can't have either of the antibodies because otherwise it would attack itself because it has both antigens. Antigens are, of course, what generates the reaction in the antibodies. So in this case, the surface protein of the cell. The O type, since it has no antigens, it has both antibodies because it's basically saying none of those two things belong here. So I hope you understand what that means when I mean antibody and antigen. Antigen means basically what generates the reaction. So antigen, what generates the anti-reaction. And that is basically the surface protein that you have. The antibody is how you defend yourself, or your policeman, or your ink that marks the bad cells for destruction when one of them invades the body. Now, interestingly enough, you see the distribution of blood types across the human race, and you will see that the most common type of blood type is the A plus blood type. And notice, by the way, that what I'm talking about here is the ABO blood system. And we'll talk about later that the fact that there actually are several different types of blood types. Okay, and here you see also an allusion to the RH system, which is the plus versus the minus kind of thing. So there's actually, those are the two main groups, by the way. You have the ABO system and the RH group system. And under the RH system, there's actually 20 different types of surface proteins in the red blood cells. And the most important surface protein is the D-type RH protein, which can be either plus or minus. And when we talk about that, that's basically what you're referring to, the D-type RH protein. And that's basically just a different type of blood factor or surface protein in the blood types. So you have several surface proteins in the red blood cell, not just the ABO protein system. You have the RH protein system that has 20 different groups of proteins. One specific group is called the D-type protein, and you can be either positive for that or negative for that. In other words, you can either have it or not have it. All right? And those are basically the most important when you're trying to figure out whether you can receive or not blood from someone else. And we're going to be talking about in the next video about that. So you can see here the distribution of the common types of blood type across the human population. All right. So remember then that the blood types are written with basically this is the code for the blood type. It's a big I. Okay, this is just the convention for it. So this big IA, like you see, stands for the A blood type. The big IB stands for the LU for the B blood type. So if you have the big IA, you're going to express the surface protein of the A blood type. If you have the big IB, you're going to express the surface protein for the B blood type. If you have the little I, that's going to be recessive, and you're going to show the O type. If you have a combination of both A and B on your genotype, then you're going to express the AB blood type. Okay, so now let's going to talk about the different phenotypes and genotypes that can show up. But before we do that, let's take a look at the distribution of the types across the human race and globally. As you can see, this graph is showing you the most common locations for the blood types. And you can see that Northern European, Scandinavian countries are very rich in that A blood type. And you can also see a lot of them in Europe as well. And in the countries which were colonized by Europe, we'll have a lot of that as well. So A blood type is kind of like an European look, mostly. Okay, you do have a lot of it in Africa, coming out of Africa as well, but basically the A blood type is more common among European descent populations than other types of populations. It's very rare in South America, as you can see there. Okay, now for the BLU, this is how many people on the world population in percentage has the BLU, and you can clearly see this is basically an Asian trend. And you see that it also has in Africa again, because Africa is where the humans evolved, so you're going to have both of them. So kind of the idea here is that the A population migrated from Africa to Europe, and the B population kind of probably was a mutation that happened somewhere in Asia and spread throughout Asia and all the continents, all the countries which were colonized by Asiatic people later. Now, the O blood type, which is a third type of mutation, is more common among South American populations and African populations. All right, so you can see the different distribution of the blood types across the world. Now, the interesting thing about blood types is that they actually show you racial patterns that do not necessarily match the racial patterns that you would expect from seeing actual skin color and hair texture and things like that, which really puts a wrench on the whole race idea. Because if you look at it, blood type, right, as a way to separate the tree of life for humans, it doesn't look like race makes sense at all. Because as you can see, the distribution of races are not necessarily matching anything you see here. There are many Asiatic races which have B blood types, but there's many African races that have all three kinds. You know, so it's not. What I'm trying to say is that the idea of race is disproved once again by blood types, and if anything, blood types is a better way to separate the world. As you can see here, there's a better sense. Asiatic is kind of B, European nations are kind of, and their callings are kind of A, and you have the B blood types on the Native American populations, or anybody descending from that Native American population. All right, so. Oh, sorry, that was the O type. Sorry about that. The B blood type is Asiatic. The A blood type is going to be more European, and the O blood type more Native American. All right, so let's review one more time the different types of the O system, and then we're going to talk about who can donate to whom. So, A type probably evolved early on for the human race. It's probably the original type. Okay, early on, people thought that the O was the original, and that the A evolved later, but naturally now we actually think that the O type is a mutation of the A type, and that the A type is the original human type, and we know that by looking at simian or the ape research, and we can see that the primates, or the primate from which we came from, was probably an A type primate. And then you have the B blood type, which evolved later among Asiatic communities, and the O type, which evolved in Native American communities. The AB happened whenever that Asiatic community kind of mixed with the European communities. All right. Now remember, therefore, that the A is considered a wild type, and that the B and the O are considered mutant types, and the AB is considered a combination type. You get that? It's not exactly a mutant. Also remember, you saw the distribution patterns, and I hope you understand that. But remember also about phenotypes, right? These are your phenotypes right there. Now let's talk about the genotypes that match those phenotypes. Notice that. The phenotype for A, you can either have two of those IA alleles, so you can be like this, or you can have a big A with a little I, and you can basically be, since A has dominant over the O, this is also going to be an A type. For the B type, it looks exactly the same, so you can either be pair or homozygous dominant for B, or you can be heterozygous with the B allele, and you're going to have the blood type. For the AB type, that's only going to happen when you're basically co-dominant by having A and B at the same time, and both looks will show up. You have to have a blood cell that has both. And for the O type, you would basically have to have the recessive trait twice in order to see the O type. And so I hope that makes sense to you in terms of genotypes generating the blood phenotypes. Now in our last video, we're going to discuss blood type donation patterns, and also do some Punnett squares of blood types as an exercise for you to predict what happens with blood types. I'll see you then.